Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve. Hello there and welcome. Several weeks ago, I published an episode featuring Captain Brian Johnson, a retired pilot for the Wolf Island Ferry. He's also a great storyteller, focusing on the island and the waters around the ferry route. In my mind, this is a natural sequel. The Marine Museum of the Great Lakes is located on a historical piece of property where shipbuilding goes back to the 1790s. The museum has gone through some frustrating times over the past 5 years, but the situation has stabilized, and the board is moving forward with plans to make it Canada's premier museum for experiencing and preserving the maritime legacy, past, present, and future, of the largest interconnected bodies of fresh water in the world. Lots to talk about. Here is the board chair, a man very passionate about the museum, and his name is Chris West. Chris, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Dave. Glad to be here.
You have a long association with the city of Kingston. You went to Queen's, and you were an entrepreneur for 25 years before you got into your current career, which is an investment advisor with 3Max, which is part of Raymond James. But during that entrepreneurial career, you developed some skills, I would guess, that you are applying to your current volunteer position as chair of the board of the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes, specifically seeing opportunities, having discipline and patience, and the ability to connect and communicate, which is something you need in your entrepreneurial career, in your investment advisory career, and now in this particular position at the museum, correct?
Those are far too kind words, Dave, but I'll take them. There may be an element of truth in what you just said.
Now, you have a passion for this particular museum. You've been the chair of the board since 2011, on the board since 2010. And this museum has gone through a lot of changes over the last several years. And I think where I'd like to start is give listeners who may not be from Kingston, who are listening to this podcast from elsewhere, an idea of what the Marine Museum is all about. What's the history of the museum itself?
I think that's a great way to open things, Dave. Go back to 1975 here in Kingston. There is no museum, I should say, go back to the 60s and 70s, and there's no museum yet. And local divers were aware that there are a lot of wrecks around Kingston. And subsequently, I think the region is well known as a diver's paradise. We're known for hundreds and hundreds of wrecks. Probably the wreck capital of Eastern Canada. And so naturally, keen amateur divers were coming up with stuff from the bottom, from these wrecks. And some of them began to talk among themselves as they would run into each other at flea markets, let's say. Say, well, I have this wheel or anchor or binnacle, but I got too many of them. I'm selling this stuff. And so there were chats and moments of kind of mutual recognition. Gosh, we're all doing this, and some of the stuff we like is ending up over the mantle, let's say, at home. But there must have been a twinge of conscience a few times, and some among this group were saying, gosh, this is kind of important heritage stuff we're bringing up from the bottom of the river and the lake. I wonder if we could do something about that. And that was the very beginning inklings of a new museum. And so by 1975, they had incorporated and they had convinced the federal government that the discontinued shipyards operation at the Kingston Dry Dock would be an ideal site for a museum to house these finds that the gang were bringing up from the bottom. So they reached out to the community and said, would you support this? And some very generous people in the community said, yes, we'll put some startup money into that. You're going to need money. But it was very fortunate that it was an important historic shipbuilding site. It's a maritime site. It was ideal in every way except it was a shambles. It had been unoccupied for about a decade since the Seaway arrived and Kingston was bypassed as a port. And ships were no longer built or serviced at this site. So it's been described to me as it was kind of a wildlife retreat. There was a lot of wildlife in these buildings back then, and raccoons' nests and otters and ocelots and everything else. But they were all shooed out, and volunteers and some money from generous benefactors made it possible to make the museum habitable, and thus began what 46 years later is now a really important maritime museum institution.
Now, in 2016, the federal government, which still owned the building that the museum was in, decided that they were going to sell it. And so a developer bought it, and you folks had to vacate and set up shop, I think at Portsmouth and Olympic Harbor. And then 3 years later, things have changed around once again, and a generous donation enabled you to buy the place lock, stock, and barrel. So it's now belonging to the museum. And you've just moved back in the last few months. And you're going through, and you and I took a quick tour through the building, and it's got so many rooms and so many doors, which is what amazed me. But there's a lot of work that's been done already and a lot of work yet to do in terms of getting it ready. Give us a sense of the amount of work that's been done in the last several months since you took over.
Well, the conditions were not as decrepit as they were back in 1975. There were no big obvious holes in the walls and the roof this time around, but the property had lain vacant for 3 years from 2016 to 2019. Any property that has no heat, no light, no functioning anything is going to suffer a lot. And in addition to that, there was some vandalism, and most of the copper piping and copper wiring was stripped out of 15,000 feet of space. So the HVAC systems were totally dysfunctional, and much of that had to be replaced. So we had to set up a dual operation of find some money and then find some volunteers and tradespeople who could get to work during COVID, because we acquired the museum in the summer of 2019, and then by January of the next year, January, February, March, we're into COVID. So we adjusted to that hiccup like everybody else has had to. The trades had to adjust. We did get trades in, and we're $600,000 in on repairs, $600,000. And that's what enables us to sit here in this, what is our library. It's bereft of its books right now, but they will be coming along in due course. But at least we're sitting in a heated library. We have light. You've got your recording gear plugged into the socket in the wall, and it's all functioning. So this is a great, great step forward, and very encouraging for all of us believers in this institution.
Now, we're going to come back to what you plan to do with the museum in a bit, but there's something that I think we should mention that I find very interesting, and you've already alluded to it, and that's the fact that the site itself is historical. Not only are you looking to bring in artifacts and objects that have some historical value based upon the Great Lakes, but you also are on a site that is historical. And shipbuilding has been done here going back how far?
Well, we say a couple of hundred years. you can certainly go back to the early 1800s, and here we are, it's 2021. So you go back to the early British period. You go back to Kingston's heyday as a port. And there's even a notion that prior to the commissioning of the 1890 era dry dock, which is now our National Historic Site and part of the property, there was a private, less ambitious form of a dry dock. There must have been informal dry docks of some description, servicing so many boats that had to be kept saleable. If you look at the period wonderful pictures, etchings and paintings from that era, and you look at the harbor, you just see a forest of masts in downtown Kingston. So we're part of that great historical sweep of time, and what the museum does is remind us that Kingston's raison d'etre has always been as a port, a maritime city. And when I came back to Kingston 15 or 16 years ago, my impression was that Kingston had forgotten its raison d'etre, that we're here because of our situation at the confluence of the Cataraqui and the St. Lawrence and Lake Ontario. It's a really strategic point, and it was a tremendously important transshipment point in the development of the whole country. It's not just a local story. So, getting back to your question, the site is historic because of those origins of building and repairing ships, and an informal dry dock was probably here before the formal one was commissioned by the government of the day in the 1890s. It's no longer something that we shout from the rooftops, but it was Sir John A. Macdonald who was the Prime Minister at the time. This was his riding, and this was a way of rewarding his riding with a very prime piece of critical infrastructure in that era. This was the only way that Kingston could stay a competitive port economy in competition with places like Oswego or further west on the Canadian side, York or Toronto.
One of the things I'm amazed about, and it's come home in more emphasis lately, I've had the opportunity to interview a couple of other people for this podcast. One of them is Captain Brian Johnson. And he brought up a whole pile of stories that he has written about, mentioning the museum as well, because this is something that is a big thing with him. And I think what we are missing, and you've alluded to it, the fact that this is a place where there are a lot of wrecks beneath the water. And it's history that a lot of us who have lived here a long time just don't know about. Either we haven't read about it, we haven't come to the museum or gone to any other spot in town where they are talking about the history of Kingston. And how do you reach out? Once you get the museum up and running, how do you reach out to the people who live here? Now, tourists are one thing, the folks in town are another. How do you reach out to them to say, we've got a real historical treasure here that we need to shout about from the rooftops?
Well, that's a very pertinent question, and I'll preface it, the response by saying it would not be adequate or appropriate or sufficient in any way for the museum simply to say, we've got the property back, we're moving back in, we're putting everything back the way it was, and hallelujah, job done. This was not a perfect institution before. We have a very proud heritage, and we've served our community in many ways. But when you're confronted with a total disaster, an existential crisis, it's a great opportunity to re-examine one's purpose and mission and goals and the strategic plan you're going to fit to them. So that's what we've done. We've built a plan out over the next 5 years, and our intention is to be more than we were before. I would say the way a traditional museum would look at things would be the perspective, well, we've collected this important stuff. And I've alluded to how in the beginning it came up from the bottom of the lake. But since then, we've got 50,000 ship plans, and I could rhyme off a lot of things that we have in storage that are coming back here. And the notion would be, well, you sit down with the curatorial staff and your exhibit planning people, and you say, what stories can we tell with the stuff, the archives and artifacts we have? That's the traditional approach, and that's what we did. But there's another way of looking at it, and it seems to be a better model for today. The new model is, well, wait a minute, who's our audience? Who are the visitors? Who are the local supporters and visitors? Who are our members? Who might be coming here once in their lifetime from somewhere else? And everybody in between. Let's define the demographics and the characteristics of typical people like that. And let's develop personae for them, and then define an ideal visitor experience for them. Notice I didn't start with saying, let's look at our stuff and decide what stories to tell about our stuff, and then market like crazy to bring people to see it. It's the other way around. Let's start with our visitors, the visitor experience that people would like to have. So if you're a young, let's say a single parent with 3 kids under the age of 8, and you come to a museum like this, previously this was not the right place to come with kids like that. So we need to include that visitor experience, that demographic profile in our mix of planning where we want to go. Similarly, if you're the young, hip, big city type of person, well, even in Kingston has hip people as well, but I'm an old fogey talking this way, but let's say you want to bring a cool millennial in for an experience, and they want to have a cool experience at the Marine Museum. That wouldn't have been the type of thing that was top of mind to deliver to that visitor in the previous era of this institution, but it is now. So I'll give you just a notion of where that could go. It means much more outreach to the community, even when we're planning where we want to go. So last winter we had a virtual public consultation on a potential ship we may acquire to put in the dry dock, a new museum ship to replace the one we lost, the Alexander Henry. And we're planning another public consultation coming up this December. So we're reaching out more. It's less of a hermetically sealed institution where we decide what's best for you out there. It's, no, come to us. We're working on something to celebrate the 50th anniversary of, I don't have the exact nomenclature, but the 50th anniversary of a Clean Water Act between the US and Canada, and it's coming up next October. And we're working with the Canadian Geographical Society and Swim Drink Fish, which is the analog of water keepers, and others.
You mentioned the 2 ships, and that was my next point. Right at the bottom of this particular page, we had the Alexander Henry. So if we're talking about people coming to the museum, in my recollection now, I didn't happen to visit when the Alexander Henry was here, but I had other people tell me that they had come to the museum and had checked out the Alexander Henry. So that gets taken away and moved somewhere else, and you are in the process of looking at the SS Keewatin as an option and negotiating, or I think you're submitting a plan to the heritage folks to get permission to bring it here. How important is it to have a ship here? Let's just focus on that particular aspect. What does that do for the museum? Are you actually working on the ship when it's here to repair it or renovate it?
Let's start with your first question. How important is it to have a ship? I am not a museologist. I'm not a historian. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm a keen museum goer. and I learned slowly by experience. I've learned in my sojourn on this board, I can say categorically, the most important and the most popular attraction for all visitors to this museum has been and always was the museum ship, because we did surveys. There's something, you go to a maritime museum, you'd expect to see at least some boats, but if there's a big, exciting ship in that dry dock, and it's right here next to Ontario Street in downtown Kingston, that's a sight. Most people in a lifetime don't have an experience to walk up the gangway onto a ship like that. It's fabulous, and you can run events and you can do all kinds of things. A lot of people in Kingston know that the former Coast Guard ship, the Alexander Henry, was run as a B&B for quite a while. It was very popular. I can tell you now, long after it's gone, there were side effects that were not so popular, including smoking up parties, the pot, the weed, and the music, and the so forth sometimes, and the bed bugs that came along with a certain constituency of clients. But suffice it to say, long after the B&B operation closed down, the ship stayed there, and it was the number one attraction here.
When it comes to bringing another ship here, getting back to one of the other questions I was asking relative to the boat itself. So if we bring the Kewahtin here, and do you plan on working on it? Does it need to be renovated? We have a dry dock, but are you going to make use of the dry dock in terms of the ship that's here?
That's a really pertinent question. So first part of the response is any ship that's old, it was built in 1907. By definition, just because of its age, will need constant maintenance, a lot of maintenance. And we're looking very carefully at that and wanting to be very certain that we allow enough for the capital maintenance. This deck will have to be replaced, let's say, at a certain age. Are we going to be able to reserve enough funds for that ongoing cost and still remain cash flow positive? It's a huge responsibility to take on. So that's the first part of the answer. Second part is, will the dry dock actually function as a drained, dry dock, which would greatly facilitate certainly servicing the hull? And it's a really apropos question, because aging steel hulls do rust and thin out over time. We've done the surveys. The ship right now is sound enough. It can be towed from where it is here. But I originally thought, well, naturally we'll drain it. That'll be an even more magnificent sight to the visitor approaching the museum. Wow, that looks like the Titanic. Well, it's a little smaller, but wow, it's that sort of era of ship. Can I go on it? Can I see it? Oh, I can? Oh, look, it's sitting on the bottom. What's that? Most people have not seen a drained dry dock. It's a massive sculptural object with terraced, hand-hewn limestone ledges from the 1890s. It would be just an awesome, beautiful sight, and it would enable not just an aesthetic experience, but also the practical aspect of access to maintaining the boat. So why am I raising this with a bit of a question mark around it? Current best practice, it seems, although there may be exceptions, we'll have to see, but current best practice is pointing towards keeping a heritage vessel floating in water, because the water provides tons and tons of pressure along the sides of the hull that help to maintain the structural integrity of the vessel. So the hypothesis is that if you remove that structural support, you're in a drained dry dock, that perhaps your historic ship will over time gradually start to pancake, they call it, flatten. I personally hope that there are ways to mitigate that risk. I would think with proper bracing, maybe, we could get around that. Because ideally, I think it would just be a magnificent way to display the ship if it could be in a dry dock and a National Historic Site dry dock, drained.
One of the things that I found very interesting in my short little tour of the museum was looking outside. And you have the dry dock, and you have the slips, so you have the ability to bring in a couple of ships or boats. And then you have this, I don't know what you call it, but it's that section that was overgrown that you have landscaped so that it's a bit of a pier or a beachhead, not a beachhead, but it's a bit of property. It's a pier outside. So one of the things I read when I was preparing for this was the interest in doing something with those slips, whether it means combining a couple of slips to attract ships that are now cruising Lake Ontario that are passenger vessels that are, mini cruise ships?
You can go from 200 feet to, I believe there's one, Viking is going to bring one in that's maybe 600 feet.
So the idea being is that if all things go according to plan, that this is an option to look at, is converting some of the slips so that you can accommodate boats that visit Kingston, like the little tug that came here, a month or two ago.
Yeah. And it's just so apt. We started this discussion talking about how Kingston began as a port, a maritime city. It's still a port and a maritime city. And this would be more living evidence of that. And how exciting if through the seasonal months of the year, these glamorous boats would be tying up here with people coming all the way from, they could be on a cruise from New York, or there are people who come from Germany, all the way from Hamburg. And they'd be stopping right here in downtown Kingston and disembarking at this historic site. So to kind of put a bow around this theme, we've been in very cooperative, close discussions, both with Homestead, the owners of the neighboring pier, the so-called South Pier, and the city as well. Ideally, we'll come up with a joint solution, and it will not just provide appropriate deep water docking, but also ultimately this will be providing a missing link in Kingston downtown waterfront trail system, so that you don't have to jog out to Ontario Street to continue on down towards City Hall on the trail. We're very, very enamored of working with our partners in that, and we think there should be funding from one source and another to make that possible.
Let's talk about funding for a second. At the beginning of the program, you talked about how much money you had spent so far in doing some very preliminary renovations to this place. And given the fact that for a living you are a money man, you may not be a museum expert or a historian, but you do have some role to play with respect to money. How does one attract some of these dollars that people have ready to make donations with? How do you get to the top of the list when it comes to people considering to whom they want to make a donation?
It starts, Dave, with what I did rather hurriedly with you, but I think we have to get people here down at the site and do what I call the walk and talk. Introduce people to the history of the site, the whole maritime port idea, and emphasize this is a one-of-a-kind museum and property with so much development potential and so much possibility to be not just a really important community institution in Kingston, but regionally and even nationally. We are the Marine Museum of the Great Lakes at Kingston. We're working right now on, and this is the kind of thing funders can get excited about. We want to celebrate that joint Clean Water Act that Trudeau and Biden will be toasting to, 11 months from now or so, with a dedicated exhibit downstairs. And we're going to have a giant floor map of the Great Lakes and the watershed surrounding them. And you'll be able to come in with your device, whether it's your phone or your pad, and it'll be a bit like a video game. You'll have to find where to go and what do I point it at, and then we're going to have augmented reality popping up, and you're going to meet an Indigenous person from 2,000 years ago, or it may be a moose, or you may be at a lighthouse in Manitoulin Island. All sorts of marvelous experiences, very interactive. So you've got to get people down here and start talking about the potential, where we come from, but especially where we're going, and that visitor experience, which is so critical. The other thing is that the Great Lakes are, if you look at them, they're 20% of the world's fresh water. They're the equivalent of the Amazon for global climate importance. How we manage this environmental resource goes right to the heart of where the whole world is going in solving global climate problems. So we're right in the center of all of that. So you've got to think there's a big important community story. Yeah, there's local history, regional history, and so forth. But we're also right smack in the bullseye of a big global discussion, and we want to be part of that.
Mm-hmm. Funders are very important, and so are volunteers. And you have, from what you tell me, quite an army of people who are in here helping out. They have been here since the museum, some of them I would guess, have been here since the museum opened in 1975, and continue to come in. What kind of person comes and volunteers here? Is it somebody who has a marine outlook to start with?
Yes and no. Often that's the case. I would say, and this is, I think, a function of being in Kingston and a function of our actual street address down here in the old part of town, there are a lot of retired people who live in the condos and apartments up and down Ontario Street. So I think historically it's been, well, gosh, I hear there are fun things happening down at the Marine Museum, and I wonder if they have a volunteer program. Well, we do. So that's one end of it, is I'm retired and I would like to get involved, and it's in my neighborhood. There's been a lot of that. The downside of that is that retired people get older, and you've got to renew that population. We also reach out, and we've got younger kids who come in too, and we always have a cohort of students in the summers who do yeoman's work. And so it's a mix. But if I could put a plug in now, we've just come back in here. We just started operating here in the last few weeks. So I want to encourage people of all ages to come and walk in at 55 Ontario Street in Kingston and ask your questions, what's on offer, because we've got lots to do. As you've seen in my quick walk and talk. Still, most of the gallery spaces need to be refurbished. And then we've got to move everything back in. There's lots of fun jobs here.
This has been a very fun conversation and a little trip. And for those people listening, this is the first time that I've done an in-person conversation on this podcast in about 2 years. But I want to thank you very much, Chris, for joining us today and telling us all about the museum and your passion for it, and all the best going forward. Looking forward to it reopening in style and moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. My pleasure.
Our thanks again to our guest, Chris West, Chair of the Board of Directors. If you'd like more information, go to your search engine and type in marmuseum.ca. That's marmuseum.ca. This episode was recorded in person in mid-November 2021.
The theme music for the podcast is Stasis Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to thekingstonianpodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.